things are the way they are because of some very deep-seated ways of thinking, ways of practicing, which aren't written down, not what's in the rules. It's how people operate every second of every day. That's what you've got to get under the skin of, not what it says on a piece of paper that's written somewhere in London. The mission is to increase the amount of capital that's being invested in tackling social challenges in the UK. The crucial part about our approach is that our key KPIs and measures are all about the market as a whole and growing the total impact investment in the UK rather than just growing BSC's impact. Our theory of change is that we can use both direct investment and work around the system to enable great amounts of capital to flow, which then will reach more organisations, which are in turn then creating the direct impact. We invest into funds, the funds invest into frontline organisations, charities, social enterprises, mission-driven businesses, which then create impact for people on the ground. The scale of the challenges and the scale of the capital need is so big that social impact investment has got to get bigger to make a dent in them. The market's grown 12-fold in the 12 years we've been working it, and the amounts of money you could potentially invest for great impact is so big, we're not even close yet.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Stephen, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Good to meet you too.
I always start these conversations by understanding a bit about your background. And you grew up in Rugby, this small town in the English Midlands, and in a Quaker family, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the Quakers are often attributed with being some of the earliest practitioners of socially responsible investing or ethical investing. So I'm interested for you to tell me about that upbringing. What was home like? What were your mother and father like? What were conversations around the dinner table like? What values were non-negotiable in your household? I'm really interested in how those early experiences shaped who you are today.
So yeah, as you say, I grew up in Rugby, which most people may have heard of as a place that a certain sport comes from. So Rugby is a pretty small, not that interesting town in the Midlands, about halfway between London and Birmingham. But many people would have been through it, or certainly people from the UK would have been through it on the train or driven past it on the motorway. Main claim to fame is clearly inventing a sport.
Is that true? The origins of rugby is there.
And that's associated with another bit of sort of history from the town, because the sport comes from rugby school. And so the one other thing that's famous about it, linked to the game, is a very prestigious, expensive private school, one of the sort of great private schools of England, like Harrow and Eton and these sort of places, that there's rugby school, which is where they invented the sport that then is now a global sport of rugby. But one of the funny things about rugby is the school is very sort of, it's its own little world and doesn't really connect to the town. So I didn't go to the rugby private school and I didn't know anyone who did, and my parents weren't associated with the school. But you have in the town this sort of enclave of this very wealthy, exclusive private school, which is sort of cut off from the rest of the town, which is a sort of strange, because the thing the town's famous for, but is actually, and where the sport comes from, but is not really connected to everyone's normal life, which is just a small industrial town in the Midlands where, I mean, these days, the main employment is almost entirely working in warehouses and that kind of thing, because it's near lots of motorways and railways. So you have all the national sort of distribution centers of huge companies like Amazon and big supermarkets.
So it's a logistic hub.
A lot of the logistics around there. That's what it is now. When I was growing up in sort of the 80s in Rugby, there's quite a lot of employment in there's one big manufacturing firm called GEC who made basically the massive turbines that go into power stations. And that was the big employer. And actually, when I was young, I used to play for the cricket club that was associated with that, with the GEC. And my parents were both sort of public sector professionals. So my mother was a psychologist working for the local health service, mainly working with older people with Alzheimer's or dementia or other needs like that, and sort of helping them manage that and helping their carers manage that. And my father was first a local government sort of clerk and lawyer, and then moved to being a planning inspector. So both very much committed to sort of a public sector, public service kind of approach, both Quakers. And I don't know how much listeners here know about Quakers. It's a fairly unusual sort of branch of Protestant religion. It started in the UK in the 17th century, has no written creed, has no hierarchy, so there are no ministers, there are no priests. Meetings are in plain meeting houses, there's no ceremony or ornament. It's a religion about simplicity and about personal truth and personal experience and sort of equality. And as you say, as you mentioned, that there's a long history in the sort of Quaker tradition of social concern, social activism, and particularly business with a social conscience. So famously, Joseph Rowntree, the chocolate manufacturer, whose legacy is several big charitable foundations in the UK, who was a Quaker, the Cadbury family of Quakers, several large sort of mutual or cooperative-based financial services companies or savings companies in the UK were set up by Quakers from back in the Victorian era. And so I think some of those sort of values that I've derived from that upbringing are concern for social equality and social purpose, importance of integrity and humility, understanding you are just one person among many. Everyone has, there's a Quaker saying, which is, there's that of God in everyone, everybody, wherever they are, whatever they're going through, however you may disagree with them or dislike things they've done, there's some value in them as a person, and you look for that, try and build on that. Currently, I'm not anymore really a practicing sort of member of the Quaker religion. It's not sort of such an active part of my life now, but those values, the interest in social and public service, and the degree of hopefully humility and seeing myself among others and understanding my connections to other people and the importance of those are still very important. Another quite unusual thing about my upbringing is that we didn't have a television in my house, which made us very, very unusual in sort of mid-1980s England. And I'm not quite sure why we never did, really. My parents never had one. Me or my sisters never really asked for one. So I think that that probably led me partly to read enormous numbers of books, which I still do, and it was always an important part of my upbringing. And I think, yes, those conversations around the dinner table were probably pretty important because we didn't have television to watch or that form of entertainment. So the news, what was going on in the world, that kind of thing was very important. And I got very interested in how the world worked, the external world, the news when I was very young, listening to, or if I was at a friend's house who did have television, wanting to watch the news. And I was really quite young, and other parents or friends of mine were commenting how this was a bit strange that, Stephen would come out play and he'd be interested when the news was on in the background. I have a vivid memory of, we've literally never had the radio on at a sort of meal time because we were all sort of talking or trying to have conversations happening. Once we had the radio playing while we were eating supper, because it was when, this is 1990, it must have been, when Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister, when there was the leadership contest that then led to her resignation. They were going to announce the result of this at just the time we were all eating, because we were all interested in the news. And my parents were both quite engaged and interested in politics. So from a very early age, I was very interested in how the world worked, politics, current affairs, what made things work the way they did in society, and that kind of thing.
So the news was received by the newspaper, or was it also radio?
Yeah, a lot of the radio, mainly the BBC, in one form or another. And then we read a newspaper which is sort of largely this paper called The Independent, which started in the mid-80s in England. And then, other papers you pick up every now and then. But those are certainly important sort of parts of it, yeah.
And do you have a television now?
I do have a television now. I had a television before. I have had a television.
Is it connected to anything?
It does work. And actually, the great things of television are actually slightly odd not having one growing up, because they're amazing, insightful, brilliant pieces of art on television, but, worth watching.
Your parents are still living. Do they have a telly now?
They do not have a television. So that my parents are now, my dad's about to turn 80 and my mum's 78. They still do not have a television and don't seem very interested in ever getting one.
Then when you went to school and you hear your classmates talking about shows or whatever they saw the night before, you never felt left out?
I mean, a little bit. But no, I would watch things at other people's friends' house. Yeah, you'd go out to someone's house after school, you'd watch certain things, cartoons when you were younger, or then slightly other things when I was older. So I never totally missed out. I think, it's funny. I don't know why. My parents always said later, they said, had me or either of my sisters, I have an older sister and a younger sister, had any of us really sort of campaigned with them for television, they would have got one. But none of us ever did. I think we all just thought, we don't have one at home, that's fine, we'll watch television when we're on holiday or we can visit, our grandparents will have television. Actually, my parents on both sides did, or friends did, or cousins did. So, okay, that's something you do on holiday or with other people, which is a bit weird.
It sounds like an extraordinarily good idea. I can see the benefit of a childhood like that, but I also remember very well the social pressure and the feeling of being out or not being able to talk about what everyone is talking about. That's interesting on how you dealt with that.
I was a fairly quiet sort of person at school anyway, and sort of, probably wasn't always, wasn't generally the center of conversations, and didn't miss having the thing that makes you the center of the conversation.
You've also referred to significant charity and social action work in your family. Tell me about that, and how did that influence you as a young person, and what did that teach you about your place in the world?
That is a Quaker thing, partly. I mean, it's not obviously uniquely. Lots of people have that sort of attitude, but my parents were involved in quite a lot of different charity and social action type of things. So, I remember all the church of all religions in Rugby, sort of once a year, they all got together and would do sort of things together, and you'd like collect money from people for a particular cause, and the Quakers were a part of that. We'd do our bit along with the other churches in Rugby. And I remember sort of helping my parents kind of sort out the paper and count the money that had been donated at events in town and this sort of little things. And my mum particularly was quite involved in several local charity and social things. So like setting up a new nursery. There wasn't a decent kind of early years nursery kind of thing in the estate where we lived, and she was very involved in sort of getting that off the ground and making it happen. And then was a governor of the school and that sort of stuff. And my dad was involved in a few charities as well. So there was always publications coming through the door that was sort of charity my parents had subscribed to or were involved in something like that. So yeah, I just think I always saw that as part of what you do, and part of recognizing that you are connected to other humans and other humans matter, and respecting that as part of what life is for.
At age 18, you enter Oxford around 1995 to study the classic PPE trifecta: politics, philosophy, and economics. Was this a deliberate choice, or did you stumble into this, and what were you hoping to accomplish with that?
I knew I wanted to study politics because as you've heard me talk about, I was very into the whole sort of news kind of affairs going on in the world from quite young, and I spent a lot of time, a sort of weird amount of time probably in my teenage years, reading about politics and history, and reading biographies of politicians or diaries of politicians or all this sort of stuff. So I was very keen to study politics. And then a teacher at school specifically encouraged me to look at the PPE degree. I was originally saying, I'll look for a university where I can study just purely politics, political science, which you can't do at Oxford or Cambridge or certainly something you can in some other places in the UK. And my teacher who taught me ancient history, sort of Greek and Roman history. I said, you should look at doing the Oxford entrance exam and studying PPE if you're so interested in politics. I looked at the course, it looked really interesting. That sort of prompted me to go down that route. And actually, in the end, at least as much the politics, enjoyed the philosophy bit of it, and was probably better at the philosophy bit. So it's probably a good thing I took that route in the end. So it worked brilliantly, and I had a wonderful time.
Were there any particular mentors or texts from this period that fundamentally altered your trajectory?
There's a book called The State We're In by a guy called Will Hutton, who at that time was the political editor of, I think, the Observer newspaper. He wrote this book about sort of British economy and society. It was very critical of the sort of neoliberal model that Margaret Thatcher had espoused during the 1980s and early 90s, and how that had taken the British economy, British society down a path that was very damaging. It was unequal, meant investment levels fell, had lots of knock-on effects. Anyone who's sort of centre-leftish or leftish in the UK in the sort of early 90s probably read that book. And I went to hear him talk about it, got to sign my copy. He's very much, sort of place and time. If you read it now, I hadn't read it for a while, but I imagine it would feel, very clearly from a long time ago. But it certainly was a big thing. I was quite influential in a lot of people who ended up in sort of Labour Party politics in that sort of period. And then at university, with a particular text, actually, probably, this is going to sound a bit off the wall compared to that, but a bit that's always stuck with me and I've gone back to a lot is the Philosophical Investigations by Wittgenstein. And particularly all the work, his concept of language games, and how we all operate within the rules of a game set by the language that we think in and work in. And that we can't abstract yourself out of that. And a lot of philosophical, actually real life sort of disputes come about through fuzziness around language and around people misunderstandings, or thinking you can sort of step out of the context you're in, out of the game the rules of the game that you're playing with that particular language. I've had an incredibly powerful analysis, and actually it's sort of played through some of the other things I've thought about since.
That's a good lens, actually. And if you speak more than one language, and in my case, I've learned them as I became an adult, you realize that language, it's a completely different lens. Each language has its own way of looking at the world.
And even within one language, even if you're just, let's say we're speaking English today, even within English, a word means something completely different in different contexts to a different user of English, the same word and phrase, and have all this different stuff associated with it. And we forget that at our peril, and that can lead you into all sorts of confusions. And I suppose it's linked back a bit to maybe the reason I like that framework, like helpful, is it's that back to the Quaker point about recognizing the where other people are coming from and the value in all humans, even if they're doing things you don't like or coming from a place you don't recognize, is they're bringing their own framework, understanding the world in a certain way and using language in a certain way that you may not understand. And there's a sort of humility there saying, well, is my frame, the game I'm playing, better than theirs? Not necessarily, but it is. I need to understand why it's different. Otherwise, we're just going to miss each other.
After you graduate Oxford 1998, you dive straight into the civil service, which fascinates me because it's so different from the typical path that many take. So walk me through that decision process to go into the civil service, and what positions did you initially hold, and where were you physically working, and what did the day-to-day look like?
The way it was it's a very obvious thing to do. You've done PP at Oxford, really interested in politics, interested in public service. Yeah, I didn't want to go and work in the city. It was a lot of my fellow PP graduates, particularly those that did more economics, worked for the investment banks, the big consultancy, that kind of thing. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something public service, social service, interested in politics, didn't want to be a politician. I knew I'd be terrible at that. Not my sort of game at all. So therefore, it's in a way, a really obvious choice in the UK system to apply for the graduate recruitment scheme called Fast Stream, where you take an exam and you go through the whole assessment centre and so on and join the civil service. So that was, I went down that route. My first job was in the Cabinet Office, which for people who are not UK listeners, it is a sort of central coordinating department that kind of pulls together the different ministries across government. My first job was actually working on a whole load of things to do with the EU. So this is obviously pre-Brexit. This is when the UK was a full member of the EU. A whole set of initiatives about kind of improving EU regulation and how it worked and simplifying it and making it more effective. It was good fun. And one of the main things it sort of aged me, I think, for many of your listeners. And the first week when I started was the first week that the department, or most of the department, had got email that worked outside government. Previously, there'd been a kind of internal government email, but you couldn't, or most people, unless you had some special separate machine and permissions, you couldn't use your email to email someone who wasn't part of the government because they hadn't worked out how to do security and networks and stuff. This is 1998. And just when I started, they'd sort of cracked that, and you could finally email someone who's in a business or a charity or something. So that was quite odd coming into an organization. And there's still lots of stuff was done completely on paper, and the paper files and all this sort of thing, which is really weird looking back. The other thing I would say, there was, again, it's funny to look back on in that first job in the Cabinet Office. I was in a building that's called One Horse Guards Road. It's a very grand building built, it must be probably early 19th century. And people who've been to London will have seen it. It's sort of on the corner of Parliament Square by St James's Park. The Treasury, it's mainly the Treasury, and the bit of it that then was the Cabinet Office. And it's a very grand building, but at the time, there had been these plans to refurbish it, which had been around for ages and just hadn't happened, and were finally about to happen. And they hadn't spent any money on maintenance or upkeep for ages because they knew they were going to do this big refurbishment. So when I started, there were cracks in the walls. Some of the toilets didn't work, and you had these big and wide corridors with paint coming off the walls in places. It was really rather extraordinary. It was sort of quite grand. There's big windows and very strange place to work. I think it was probably a year or two after I started, then everyone moved out of the building and they completely redid it. And now it's a perfectly nice modern office. It's rather pleasant.
Backing away from the policy aspect, were there any surprising early lessons learned during your time in that early civil service job?
Being in a big bureaucracy like that, a lot of it is about trying to line up different bits of the machine to point in the same direction. When you start, particularly sort of, very young, 21, you quite naively think that everyone sort of wants the same thing, and you sort of, you can sort of marshal people behind the same sort of direction, and you don't. And I had to learn about kind of, different organizational imperatives and tensions, and why this bit of the government wants to pull in a different direction to this bit of the government. That's something I had to sort of get my head around, as anyone does who joins a big, complex organization. There's nothing special about me or my job for that. That's just what everyone has to learn at the beginning.
Yeah, youthful ignorance is so refreshing. So then around 2002, you made the decision to go back to university for a master's in public policy, and you went to Queen Mary University in London. That's a significant investment of time and energy. And when you're already on your career path, what made you pause your professional life and go back for more education? And what were you looking for?
Really, it was the recognition that my undergraduate education, while I loved it, it was brilliant, was pretty generalized, and you didn't get very deep into anything. And I'd had a period, particularly when I'd been working with a few sort of more senior people who I felt had a sort of deeper toolkit and deeper set of knowledge about how to tackle policy problems, how to think differently about different ways of coming at public policy challenges. And I felt I was sort of missing some of that and could use the professional education and sort of time to really focus on it. So it's kind of, getting a deeper, more grounded toolkit of different ways of coming at public policy, which I felt that sort of going back to the academic piece was going to help me do. And I think it did to an extent. It was, there's a mixed bag in the course, but some of it was very helpful and gave me a bit more of a, sort of frameworks, which I have used subsequently and was very interesting.
After you graduated from Queen Mary, you went back into the civil service. And over the course of about the next decade, you held a variety of senior roles in the UK civil service. In fact, your CV reads like a masterclass in navigating complex governmental structures. Let me run through some of these roles. From 2005 to 2007, you were deputy director at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the Cabinet Office. So what was that about and how did that come about?
This was in the sort of latter part of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister, and he used the strategy unit as a sort of, it really was like an internal version of a strategy consultancy. The Prime Minister and his office and his direct closest advisors would ask us to go and do projects on things that he felt had been forgotten or sort of fallen between gaps in the machine, or he wasn't happy with working right. So really in the way a corporate CEO would call in a corporate strategy function or go and hire in McKinsey or Bain or whoever to come do something. And we were a mixture of civil servants and secondees in from outside, a lot of whom came from a strategy consultancy background. We had all the flaws of that strategy consultancy model, a slight tendency to parachute in and think you know best, but also the advantages of a bit of distance and clear sight from being in the midst of the day job. So I did a whole set of projects around child poverty one about transport, some stuff around public service reform, how to set up. So a whole set of project-based strategy work, which I really loved and learned an awful lot on. And actually, I think probably for my whole government career, the network of people I have from that particular role was probably the most important, because some of them have gone on to very, very senior roles in government, but others have gone and done really interesting things outside. And there's this real sort of a hotbed of talent, I think, of people that are very high quality people who are really driven by sort of making public service better, working to get to that point.
And then from 2007 to 2009, you were head of strategy at the Department for Energy and Climate Change. So tell me about that.
I was there when that department was formed, because government sort of reorganized itself to bring together use on energy in one department and climate change was with other environmental stuff, and they were brought together in one department. And so it was similar. I was sort of bringing the department together and doing a series of projects around sort of how to drive forward that agenda. This is actually interestingly working for Ed Miliband, who's now back again in government doing a similar job. He's almost on his second round as being in charge of kind of energy and climate in government, but working in the first round. So things about retrofitting housing to make it more energy efficient, and just some stuff about carbon trading. But again, a similar sort of quite a sort of cross-cutting strategy kind of role, similar to what I'd done in the Cabinet Office, but in that particular policy area.
And then 2009 to 2011, you were the Assistant Chief Executive at the Homes and Communities Agency. So that's different. What was that about?
So that was about trying to broaden my experience beyond central government and do something a bit different. So the Homes and Communities Agency, which now is called Homes England and does some slightly different stuff, is a big sort of multi-billion pound delivery agency for government funding of social housing, urban regeneration, all that kind of thing. And I went there I ended up playing all sorts of different roles. We went through quite a big restructure while I was there. So I was partly doing some change management around the communications function, the central corporate sort of strategy function, and various particular projects for the chief executive and so on. So yes, that was about broadening my horizon beyond central government into a more delivery agency, which definitely got a different perspective, felt quite different, but that was intentional. And before then switching back into the central government again for the next period, I sort of went from one extreme to the other anyway.
And then continuing what seems to be a 2-year itch, 2011.
One of the failings of the British civil service is senior people move around too much. And I was definitely guilty of that myself. The incentives of the system are such that they push you to do that, actually. And it's a problem. It's not a good thing.
Following that was 2011, 2013. You were Deputy Director and Acting Director of the Cabinet Secretariat in the Cabinet Office. Seems to be a lot of cabinets there.
Cabinet Secretariat, this is the original bit of the Cabinet Office that was set up originally back in the First World War, when the British government was struggling to kind of coordinate itself around fighting a global war as it was back then, and how the different bits of the government were pointing in different directions and not doing what the Cabinet and the Prime Minister wanted. So they set up what they called the Cabinet Secretariat, which was basically to try and stick everything together and stop departments fighting each other and sort of resolve disputes and sort of try and help the government machine pull in the same direction and support the Cabinet to drive that. And that still exists, and that's what this role was. And what was particularly interesting about doing it in this period was this when we had the coalition government in the UK, the first one for a very long time, where we had Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties in coalition. And quite a bit of that job was from the civil service point of view, not political point of view, but helping sort of resolve wrangles and come up with things that worked across the coalition and were sort of acceptable to both sides. A lot of sort of building compromises, ensuring that, one party had kept the other party in the loop and that everyone was sort of pulling in the same direction. And I was particularly responsible around sort of social policy, so health, welfare, education, as well as some sort of constitutional stuff. It was a great job because it was really interesting. A particularly fun bit of the job was I got to take the minutes at cabinet meetings, funnily, very old school because for security reasons at this point, you hand vote minutes. You couldn't take electronic recording devices into the cabinet rooms. It wasn't allowed for security reasons. So you had to handwrite and then type up the minutes over the cabinet, which was great fun and I really enjoyed doing it. But yes, it feels slightly old school now looking at. I don't know if that's what they still do. Actually, I don't know.
Maybe not a transferable skill.
No, entirely useless to anything else, but it was a fun experience. I just get a kick out of that. So
yeah, and finally, from 2013 to 2016, so it looks like almost a 3-year stint. You held the Director of Criminal Justice Policy position at the Ministry of Justice. So that seems to be a change. What was that about?
I'd always been quite interested in the criminal justice issues and had dipped into them at various points in the career previously. But yes, this job looks after things like policy on sentencing, rehabilitation of offenders, working with the senior judiciary and connection to the police and other bits of the system. It was a really fascinating job. I really enjoyed it. And I've maintained a sort of interest in the criminal justice system since. Yes, we were wrangling with all sorts of things like rising prison population, around how UK law interacts with European law, about various criminal justice things, several changes of senior minister who try to drive different policies. It's a really important area of work. You often dealing with some of the most difficult issues in society in a way. The things that end up in the criminal justice system, it's often the backstop for some of the biggest social problems. So if you're interested in that kind of social change, social challenges, criminal justice is where a lot of it comes home to roost. So I was really glad to have that opportunity.
And that's an extraordinary range of experiences you've had. What was driving you through these different roles, and how did these experiences change you as a person?
Yeah, what was driving me through, and I suppose the underlying theme, which has then carried on to my role at Better Society Capital, is complex social problems and how do you tackle them at a big collective social scale. How do you make a difference to these things? The challenges of ill health, of mental education, of poverty. How does society organize itself to do a better job on all these things? So that's the sort of theme through a lot of it. What it changed me is, I developed just a much more nuanced, sophisticated understanding of the different ways you can tackle things, the complexities, the non-linearity, how different bits of government and other organizations relate to one another. All those sort of things, you just get more over time, so richer and richer understanding. I say back to that sort of naive view when you start, which you sort of, come up with an idea and everyone agrees it's great and they all go and do it. And then actually nothing works that simply. Nothing's in straight lines, and everything involves working together across boundaries and with other people, and things don't happen in the sequence or the time frame you ever think. It's always slower, more complicated, or indeed more rapid because of a crisis, or everything is more diverse and complex than you think it is. And that's what I guess I learned over time.
You mentioned previously that during your time in government, there would be moments when ministers would wonder why nothing was changing despite all these strategies being put in place. Tell me about that, and how did this shape your thinking about culture and values?
The time it particularly came up, which I think I mentioned in the book, my Culture and Values book, it was in the sort of later days of Tony Blair's government. So the Labour Party had been in power for getting on for 10 years or 9 years. So a single party, a lot of stability and focus, 9 odd years, focused on all these ministers saying, we've tried all these things on, we've tried to sort of tackle poverty and try and tackle why the health service isn't delivering what we want, or tackle educational standards, particularly for people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Nothing's moving. Well, why did nothing change? When you listen to them talk, so much kept coming back to kind of culture of delivery institutions, also culture of government itself, and indeed cultural assumptions in wider society. And it's that kind of culture strategy for breakfast being that, has been around for a long time. Culture, eat strategy for breakfast, lunch and dinner, frankly. And those implicit assumptions, values, norms, just the ways people behave day to day, the way institutions behave day to day, they don't shift quickly. They can distort the best laid policies and plans. And I think I came to that conclusion in all these years in being in government as were these ministers who I heard all sort of saying, oh, why is nothing changing? Why is nothing changing? Was because things are the way they are because of some very deep-seated ways of thinking, ways of practicing, which aren't written down. It's not what's in the rules. It's how people operate just every second of every day in an office or a building or a school or hospital right across the country. And that's what you've got to get under the skin of, not what it says on a piece of paper that's written somewhere in a building in London.
Was that your insight and all of these people around you asking why nothing's changing? Were they part of the culture that was causing that and they did not see that?
I think a lot of them did see it. They just weren't sure what to do with that insight. And I'm still not entirely sure what to do with it either. It's not always a very helpful thing to say. Say, well, it's really hard to change stuff because it's all out there and you can't control it. So a lot of the politicians, not all of them, a lot of them sort of did realize that, but then just, we're like, well, but the voters expect me to change these things. But I feel like I've got these levers, but the levers don't seem to quite deliver. But I feel I'm accountable for making happen. So I think most people in government or indeed outside government who work with government sort of know all that. So it's not like I had some great insights. I did this like blindingly obvious, but it's more, what do you do with that as an insight? And how does that affect your behavior and how you set up a system and how do you re-engineer your practice? In that context, I think is where it gets quite interesting.
It's what do we do with that? And then where are we going to lunch today? All right. So that brings us to 2016. And after this impressive government career that you had, you made this leap to Better Society Capital, which at the point in time was actually called Big Society Capital. And you landed there first as the head of strategy and market development. What prompted that change from a pretty substantial career at that point in government service to BSC? Was there a moment when you realized you needed to move into a different sector?
There's sort of a push factor and a pull factor going on here. And the sort of the push factor from the government side was I had a successful career. I'd really enjoyed it. And I was kind of thinking about, what would be the next move? What would be the next job I'd go and do? And I really enjoyed that Ministry of Justice job. I really cared about the criminal justice stuff I've been working on. And I thought, okay, this job's been brilliant. But as I said, the dynamics and the incentives and sort of the way the system works at senior levels in the civil service, you're expected to sort of move on every 3 or 4 years or so. So I was thinking, what job would I go and do next? And I was struggling to work out what I would find that I'd enjoy as much as the one I'd just done, because I thought I really cared about the issues. I thought it was really interesting. I had a great team. And I was thinking, okay, well, what am I going to do next? It's going to be as good as this one inside government. I'm not sure. I'm quite sure what it is. And then I was also looking at the experience of the level above me in the hierarchy in the civil service. And I wasn't quite ready for that yet, but another job or two, then you possibly get promoted. And I was thinking, those jobs don't look great. They look hard. They look politically exposed. They look like you have to spend all your time dealing with nasty bureaucratic infighting and people issues rather than any of the interesting policy stuff. I'm not sure that's what I want to do. And if I don't, I need to start exploring options outside and broadening my range of choices at least. So I'm not sort of just traveling myself into a sort of, pathway. So I thought, okay, I'm not sure what the next job in government would be. I'm not sure that's the right path. So let's have a look outside, see what's possible. I looked around various things. And the reason that BSC was the place to go, a couple of things. One was I knew a bit about BSC. I'd come across it a little bit when I was in the cabinet office. And I knew some people, at least particularly one person who worked at BSC who I really respected and really told me great things about the organization. And then the other big attraction actually was the fact that BSC covers the full breadth of social impact. And it's quite easy stepping out of government to end up going into something that's very closely allied to what you were doing in government. So, I could have possibly left Ministry of Justice and gone and worked for a criminal justice charity or a organization that works in that space, which is fine. But then you start pigeonholing yourself into you're a criminal justice person. That's what you do. And I wasn't that keen on that because I'm, as you probably picked up from the earlier stuff in the career, I'm very interested in sort of the broad range of social challenges and social problems and how the system as a whole work that make policy and change things or don't change things at work. So I was keen to find an organization that had a kind of breadth of scope to go into. So I was looking for something with a big broad scope. I'd heard great things at BSC. The right job came up at the right time in terms of that was very heavily focused on strategy. It was what I'd done a lot of work on. So that all came together for it to be the right move at that time.
And then 4 years after you joined and were working in strategy, you became actually the chief executive officer. And if you do the maths, I have to mention this was around 2020. So you were taking the CEO role literally just as the pandemic was hitting.
It was May 2020, so we're already in full lockdown. So the previous CEO had announced he was leaving, and he announced at the beginning of the year, pre-pandemic, anyone had heard of COVID. So I'm leaving, in May 2020. And obviously, we had no idea that was going to be kind of, whether it was 6 weeks into global lockdown. Initially, I was just interim CEO and I became permanent sort of later on. But yeah, I took over in the completely remote, middle of lockdown, a very bizarre experience, just downright weird for everybody. I mean, not just for me.
It had to be challenging just with the pandemic, but you also had a school-age child at home with you as well.
And yes, I did. Yeah, I did. So we were doing homeschooling, trying to keep a 9-year-old interested in life when you couldn't do most things you normally did, while also picking it up. It was a pretty strange. Looking back at it, it just feels so odd.
You did prove you can do it all,
For a short period, not necessarily very well.
So for people who aren't familiar with Better Society Capital, give me a high-level overview of BSC and help us understand what you do, what's the mission that gets you out of bed in the morning, what are the problems that you and the organization are trying to solve, and what's the theory of change that guides the organization?
So the mission is to increase the amount of capital that's being invested in tackling social challenges in the UK. And that's all kinds of capital and all kinds of social challenges. And the way we approach that is sort of twofold, the two linked ways into sort of theory of change bit, in that we have our own capital to invest, and we aim to do that in a way that grows the overall market and brings in other capital alongside us. And we also try and more broadly create a set of conditions that encourage investment to flow towards social impact in the UK. So we're sort of directly investing and then enabling others to invest by creating a sort of wider set of conditions. And the crucial part about our approach and so who we are is that our key KPIs and measures are all about the market as a whole and growing the total impact investment in the UK rather than just growing BSC's impact. A key metric for our current strategy is we wanted to at least double the total size of the social impact investment market in the UK. It's not at least double BSC's balance sheet or our own investments or our own profit or anything like that. It's about the total market. And those, all the key KPIs at that sort of level. The theory of change is that we can use both direct investment and that sort of work around the system to enable greater amounts of capital to flow, which then will reach more organizations, which are in turn then creating the direct impact. So we sit at a wholesale level. So we invest into funds. The funds invest into frontline organizations, charities, social enterprises, mission-driven businesses, which then create impact for people on the ground.
We're going to drill down more, like to make sure we're all on the same page. Break down social impact investment for those who might be new to the concept. How would you explain it to someone who's never heard of it before? And what makes it different from traditional investing?
The crucial part of it is we're looking to make investments that have a financial return, but also a measurable positive social impact. And that is the absolute crux of it. Linked to that is we are generally, in fact, for us, pretty much exclusively investing in the investment is flowing to organizations where creating that measurable positive social impact is part of what they're trying to do. It is not just a byproduct of the activity they're doing anyway, but is in some way integral to their mission. And that may be because they are a charity where that's the case, or they might be a company that's baked into articles or whatever, some other form. So money is flowing to organizations that are trying to create a positive social impact and are assessing themselves on that basis, but is also creating a financial return as well.
Every field has its challenges. What are the biggest barriers you face in social impact investing? And what misconceptions do you constantly have to battle against?
Misconception, one of them is, and this is a constant misconception, is that there is some kind of relatively linear trade-off between financial impact and social impact, and that higher financial impact investments will be lower social impact, and you'll have lower financial returns on the higher social impact investments. There clearly are cases where that is true, but if we look at our portfolio, it isn't true at a portfolio level or even at investments within funds, that the investments we have that have the greatest social impact and that we've measured and tested that are not particularly the ones with lower financial impact. So it's not a line. It's not even a kind of curve. It's more like a scatter chart. You actually can't really find a correlation at all. So we have low financial and low social impact investments where it just haven't worked at all. We have high financial impact and low social impact investments. We do have some of those. We also have high, and we have ones which are in the other quadrant. So we've got the whole scatter chart. There's a narrative that is very common and this is actually interestingly both from investors in the more financial sector, but also from the sort of the social sector and charities saying, well, there's a trade-off here. And, where are you on the spectrum of impact versus financial returns? Well, that's not our experience after doing this 12 years, that it works that simply. And there are trade-offs and choices you make in there, but it's not a linear thing. Then back to the barriers, that misconception and others, I think that the main challenge we have is simply that we're as yet not big enough. The scale of the challenges and the scale of the capital need is so big that social impact investment has got to get bigger to make a dent in them. So, to take an example, one of the biggest growth areas, which we've been involved in alongside others, is investing in social and affordable housing in the UK. So housing for people who often otherwise would be in temporary accommodation, potentially homeless, or women fleeing domestic abuse. We don't have a particular fund to focus on them, all these sorts of areas. That market's gone from very little to a few billion, which is great. It is amazing. It's now housing thousands of people. But it needs to go from a few billion to several tens of billions to be anywhere near tackling the homelessness challenge we've got in the UK, which is arguably the worst homelessness challenge in Europe. We've scaled up a lot, and that's great. And we've been part of that along with others, not just us doing that. But to get to actually really tackling the problem, we've got to do another scale jump, which is probably harder than the first one. So that's the sort of thing that keeps me up at night. I mean, not too often, but the back of my mind is like, the market has grown 12-fold in the 12 years we've been working in this, and a lot of that's down to BSC. They're not just us, but we're still, the challenges are so big, and the amounts of money you could potentially invest for great impact is so big. We're not even close yet.
I want to go back over the funding story of BSC, which is fascinating. If my memory serves me right, I think BSC might have been created around 2012 or something like that. Spoke with Kieran Boyle a bit about it on a previous show. It was funded initially with 600 million quid, and 400 million quid came from dormant bank accounts and 200 million quid came from major high street UK banks. Where did the idea for that unique funding structure come from, and what made that possible?
The dormant assets piece, which is the dormant bank accounts piece, which is really unusual, came from a commission which looked into this back in, I think it's 2008, but I might have got that slightly wrong. And this, one of your other former guests, Sir Ronald Curran, that you've talked to, was the driving force behind setting it up and unlocking that money. And yes, it turns out that there's really a lot of money in dormant bank accounts. And this is bank accounts that haven't been touched, or there's been no contact with the person for 15 years. So they're really pretty dormant. And the way it works is you still have an absolute right to get your money back at any time if you can prove that it's yours after that long. But there is a lot of money there, and it can be used for good purposes. But yes, Ronnie probably talked about this in your previous podcast, but he was absolutely instrumental to making that happen. And a piece of legislation, Dormant Accounts Act, passed in the UK to unlock that money for social purposes, including divisional capitalisation of BSC. It's now used for other purposes as well, because actually there's far more than that, 400 million in the pot. And then the high street banks came in, a part of a sort of deal with the then government at the time. This is post-financial crash. There was a whole load of discussions between government and banks about how they could sort of almost rehabilitate themselves to an extent after some of what had happened in 2008 and some of the things had gone on, and contributing to this kind of initiative, I think, was part of that conversation.
Was this dormant money well known and talked about, or was it like a really best kept secret?
I'm not sure, because at the time I wasn't obviously that involved. I mean, as a sort of fairly well-informed public policy official working in other areas at the time, I didn't know about this, but I don't know how widely this had been talked about and thought about elsewhere in the system at the time. So it's a good question. But yes, it's subsequently other countries have looked into it and sort of tried to imitate the British model on this, because it's a really interesting one.
Well, Switzerland had a very different approach to that.
Well, yes, that's true. That is true.
How does having this unique capital structure influence what you're able to do?
It means we can be very long term, which is crucial, because we've got this sort of corpus of capital that we've been set up with, and we're able to take a long view, which is incredibly important. A lot of the funds we invest in are quite long term, and the things we've done that have worked and scaled have been things we've committed to over multiple years. Happy to talk more about those if people are interested in detail. We also means we're pretty independent, because this is not government money. So we are either seen by a trust, the oversight trust, which keeps us on mission, make sure we use the money appropriately and are well governed and don't waste it or anything like that. Quite independent. And so it makes it a little bit like a foundation. But then also we have having the bank shareholders who do keep an eye on returns and sustainability, and make sure that we are making investments that ultimately, hopefully, will return and then come back and we can reinvest them. So we're trying to be sustainable ourselves and build a sustainable market, but able to take a long-term view around that, which I think is a really fortunate position to be in, actually.
You've referred to your returns falling across the spectrum. What kind of returns are you targeting at the portfolio level?
At a BSC level, so this is net of all our costs and not portfolio level, our return target is 1%, which it was originally higher, and that was originally 4-5%. And we concluded that wasn't realistic based on the sorts of things we were meant to be doing. That translates into the social investment portfolio is targeting a return of around sort of 3%-ish, 2 to 3%, because obviously we net off costs and cash we have to hold and various other things like that. I mean, it's fair to say you haven't achieved that over our lifetime, because you get a natural phase where if early investments we made, some which were a bit experimental or different that haven't worked out, or pay money out in the early days and don't get much back. So we're confident we will deliver that target, but so far we're a little bit behind on that because of a backwash of things we did, which some of which are, say, experimental or riskier or so on. But overall, net at the BSC corporate level, we're seeking a 1% return on a rolling 5-year basis.
And what are your capital providers expecting in return?
The Oversight Trust, which oversees the dormant bank accounts, I mean, they're expecting us to build a market which is bigger than us, is sustainable, has other players in, and draws in other capital alongside us. So they look for us to maintain ourselves while building a bigger market alongside us. And similarly, the banks, actually, they're looking for shareholders, they're looking for us to make that return and look after their money and be sustainable, but also to do it in a way that kind of promotes social impact investment more broadly and makes that a sort of thriving market in the UK, which is good for them and good for everyone.
So the bank investors are not looking for a certain return. This was
the 1% overall BSC return is a figure that they've signed up to, and so they will, and ultimately, as and when we pay a dividend, some of that will be, the banks will be eligible for some of that. We haven't yet paid a dividend. We will do one day.
It's totally concessionary return.
In terms of the bank, the commercial bank, I mean, it's not the return that the shareholder banks will get is not what they'd expect from a normal equity investment.
In 2023, you changed the name from Big Society Capital to Better Society Capital. What was the story behind that decision, and what were you hoping to signal with that change?
We found that increasingly people found the name Big Society Capital a bit confusing, and particularly people coming newer into our space or who had been or overseas partners we work with or new investors they didn't really understand what this sort of big society concept was. It stopped making sense to people because it wasn't terminology that was widely used, and we found people finding it quite confusing. So we thought, okay, have a name that places actually what we do and is easier to understand, but we'd rather not give up the BSC. Lots of people abbreviate it anyway. There's brand value in that. We don't have to rebrand everything. Let's keep it simple, not spend lots of money on a rebrand. So something that kept the BSC, which a lot of people use as an abbreviation anyway, and actually says what we do, i.e. we invest capital for a better society, seemed to make a lot of sense. So we probably should have done it earlier, frankly, because once we did it, it seemed very logical. You agonize over these things, don't you, and take longer.
Give me a flavor of BSC's investment strategy. What asset classes are in your wheelhouse? What's the typical duration of your investments? And perhaps your typical ticket size, and what are the non-negotiable criteria for any investment that you make?
All investments we assess against 3 pillars, which is financial return, impact, and what we call systems change, which is their contribution to building that wider market and bringing another capital or breaking new ground or otherwise moving the market on and changing the wider system. So those are the pillars, and meeting at a base level on all those 3 is non-negotiable, and that's the sort of framework we use in decision making. I mean, the other crucial thing that is pretty much non-negotiable is we're a fund investor, so fund of funds investing from almost at the wholesale level, and we do some co-investments. So therefore, we end up investing directly into a front line where one of our managers has already invested, but they originate that. But we're very much a fund investor. So, and we're UK. So although we might invest in a fund that has some elements outside the UK, there needs to be a big UK chunk of impact. It doesn't have to be 100% UK. There needs to be a decent amount that's the UK, and clearly it has to create social impact. So within those parameters, we do most things. So we invest in funds that are doing equity, that are doing debt, that are doing real assets of one sort or another. We invest in some very large funds, or we're a very small part. We invest in some small funds, or we're a very large part. We invest with large fund managers who are trying to sort of move into impact space. We invest in very small startup fund managers. So it's a really big range within the parameter of fund investments. I mean, ticket size, we will do some fairly small things, like £1 million. Our biggest individual investments are probably around sort of 20 million. That's pretty unusual to do 20 million to a single We do quite a lot that are between 5 and 10 million into a single fund. But there is a distribution there, but the sort of median is around that sort of high single digit sort of number. But yeah, the underlying assets are quite varied, but they all fund investments of that size. Duration, again, that varies quite a bit, but some are pretty long duration, some are open-ended, some are 7-year funds, 10-year funds. So we do tend to operate on quite a long time horizon. Yeah, the nature of those sorts of private asset funds that we're investing in.
You've chosen a fund of funds investment approach rather than doing direct investments. What are the strategic advantages that this model gives you that investing direct doesn't?
I mean, this goes right back to the beginning, actually, in the way BSC was set up, because the goal was and still is to build a wider market and expand the market. The feeling was that if we did the direct investments, we'd end up sort of crowding out other players, dominating the market. Whereas if we seeded funds that then could then attract co-investment from others, then we were building something that was more sustainable, and we were supporting a range of fund managers to kind of grow and develop, have more assets under management, who could then raise funding from others, originate new fund ideas. So right from the beginning, we were set up, and it's sort of in our mandate. That's the way we operate. It's sort of less a strategic choice we're making sort of tactically now. It's more it's baked in from the start that we operate at that wholesale fund of funds type level in order to not, particularly when we started, we were quite a big part of the market, potentially our capital, big potentially. And then if we'd done directs, we would have sort of smothered everything else. So it wouldn't have worked.
BSC focuses on 4 verticals: social and affordable housing, social lending, social outcomes, and impact venture. How did you decide on these 4 areas, and what was the process you went through for selecting them?
This was on the last strategy sort of update which took place just sort of coming out of the pandemic. And I was quite new as the CEO. And really it was about looking at where we saw some traction, progress, where could we see that there was some movement begin to attract other people, and where impact was happening. So it was just a sort of fairly pragmatic. There's no sort of great art around it. It's saying these are things where we can see that we can make investments, is working, and we can see that there's a chance we could sort of express and communicate what meaningful goals were over a 5-year period. If we're growing those markets, we could sort of see a path to doubling, or in some cases more the size of those markets. So yeah, there's nothing sort of wildly sophisticated about those areas, but they were a sort of crystallization of where we saw, things we could make progress on, where we added value, and that there were partners who'd come with us on that journey.
Could you walk me through each of these verticals? And when you do, I'd like you to highlight what makes each one of these distinct, and how do they differ in terms of risk and return expectations, and importantly, impact potential.
Starting with the social and affordable housing, that's probably the easiest to explain, really, because it is what it is. Housing for people excluded by the mainstream housing market. And particularly in the UK context, this is a really big issue, because housing problems and the lack of affordable housing underpin a whole load of other social challenges that people face. So it is a very big challenge here in the UK. And we invest in this market a mixture of sort of what we call general needs of social and affordable housing for just people on low incomes who need housing, and then some housing models that are targeting particular groups with particular needs. So that's, as I mentioned earlier, women fearing domestic abuse, children leaving the care system, ex-offenders, people who've had a history of homelessness who need additional support, additional kinds of provision, more specialists. So we do both of those things. And this area is scaled pretty fast. But as I also said earlier, the need for more money is even greater. The needs are very large indeed. As we invest in a range of funds in that space, including some which are run by pretty big commercial real estate managers who are trying to come into this area and attract impact capital, and also some more specialist impact-driven fund managers who've built up their expertise in delivering some of the more specialist stuff. Impact venture. So this is really the view that some of the techniques and tools and approaches of sort of venture capital investing in startup, tech-driven businesses, some of that can be targeted to social good. And there's been quite a movement in a lot of it in London, actually, around what sometimes gets called tech for good. So using, that sort of innovation ecosystem that we see more broadly in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, but using it particularly with a view of tackling social problems. And increasingly you're seeing founders who want to found startups, often tech startups, who want to make a significant social impact while doing so, as well as returning money to themselves and their investors and so on. And we saw that, that sort of emerged in the early days of BSC as something that was sort of growing, and it's got a lot more momentum. It's interesting saying now, one thing we've done is we've built a community called Impact VC, essentially, of the sort of VC players who want to create serious impact and originally focused on the UK, and it's now actually got traction in Europe as well. We've got some external funding to help grow it. It's got sort of a bit beyond what BSC could do on our own. And that's been really, really interesting developments in the last few years. So then third vertical, social lending, this is a bit broader. So this covers all sorts of debt finance to social purpose organizations. And that's everything from charity bonds, so large charities issuing bonds where we play a role of stimulating that market and ensuring that big issues get away, to our significant shareholders in two social banks, banks that particularly focus on banking the charitable sector or other non-profit organizations who sometimes have problems getting banked by the mainstream for various reasons. So Charity Bank and Unity Trust Bank, we're big shareholders in. And then other forms of debt finance. And this is often blended finance where there's a level of grant as well as loan capital going into often smaller, more community-based organizations. And there's a whole range of funds do that, including some that are more geographically based in particular parts of the UK. And the final one, social outcomes contract, which is the smallest of the four. This is where public sector bodies, and whether that's local government, central government, or the health service, are commissioning services on the basis of outcome payments. So they're saying if you can take these young people at risk of dropping out of school, if you can support them in various ways so they get through school, pass their exams, and go on to a good future, and then we'll pay X £1,000 per person. Now, lots of organizations, those social sector organizations deliver the services that get paid on that outcomes based, obviously need upfront capital to run the services, going to get paid later. So the role of an investor, i.e. us and others in this case, why that upfront capital enables people to deliver against the outcomes contracts. And it's the smallest area, but it's really high impact, really interesting. I can talk for hours by each of these.
So you're investing both equity and debt. How would you characterize the return expectations by these different verticals? So
there's a real mixture there. So in the social property area, you're generally looking at mid to high single digit returns. Funds are targeting 6-7% sort of returns over a long life. Often you tend to have a long period where you don't get much returns while you're building a property portfolio and refurbishing properties and so on. And it comes through later. In the impact venture space, the dispersions of returns are very large. Like any venture investing, there will be some funds, and there are some funds in our portfolio, they're going to return, several times their money. There's some they're going to lose a lot of money. At a portfolio level, we'd expect to, like most portfolios of venture funds, we expect to get a pretty healthy return. But there's a lot of dispersion around that, and we're very cautious of that, and we go into it with that view. In the social lending, it depends on which part of the market we're talking about there, about what risk position we're taking. So particularly some of these sort of blended finance funds where there's often a first loss cover or something. So then return will be maybe 4%, 5%, but equally the downside risk is quite low. Unsecured debt funds, higher return, but correspondingly higher dispersion, higher chance of risk, higher chance of loss. So there's a mixture there. Outcomes contracts, and again, it's a smaller market, quite specialized, but again, looking sort of mid-single digit returns, give or take, depending on what kind of piece of that we're talking about.
Which of these has been the most challenging to execute well?
I think for different reasons, the two that have been most challenging are some of the lending and social outcomes piece. On the lending side, that's been challenging because it's clear that there's all the social impact and all the desire for lending small loans to fairly small charities, community-based organizations. The model isn't economic without subsidy because the transaction costs are really high and the default rate's pretty high. And absent anything, you're probably going to, on average, lose 15-20% of your money, just partly because the transaction costs are so high. So then you need to have grant, subsidy, or in some cases, we can leverage guarantees from government bodies and these kind of things. But you need to pull those things into the mix to make it work. And that's been challenging. We've learned a lot over the years how best to do that. And we're now in a much better place than we were, but it was often very tricky. The other area there's been a lot of challenge is actually on the social outcomes piece, where the impact evidence is really good. Those models have now helped over 70,000 people in the UK. As those 70,000 people, some of those are some of the most complex needs in society. The impact evidence is really good. It's the whole way those models work. They only pay when you deliver an outcome, so you measure really well. But the problem is that for them to work, you need changes in commissioning practice by the public sector, which would actually be quite difficult to mainstream. It's often very patchy, and the central government is sort of blown hot and cold whether they want to pursue this kind of model and support local government to do it. So we've had a bit of a hiatus in there. We haven't made a new investment in that space for a long time because government's kind of lost interest. Interestingly, the new government in the UK is now showing interest again, and I'm actually doing a lot of work with the team at the moment on trying to unlock some of that. So we're hopeful that will come back, that will sort of kick off again, but it's been an uphill struggle for a few years.
I'd love to hear some real examples of investments that you've made across these different verticals and to know what kinds of returns you've achieved and how do they compare to conventional investments in similar sectors.
On the property side, there's a whole set of funds we invested in from a fund manager called Resonance, who are a social impact dedicated fund manager in the UK. And their model is to, their funds purchase houses, just normal houses on normal streets, and refurbish them and then let them out on long leases to charity partners, charities who work with people who are in very high housing need, usually people who are otherwise living in temporary accommodation. And temporary accommodation in this context usually means terrible conditions in sort of bed and breakfast or hostels or really poor quality, like the one level above being homeless. And instead they're being given a stable, secure, long-term home with a charity that's managing that and supporting it. So we've invested in a whole set of funds in that space. We invested in the very first fund that was housing, it was 50 or something people in London. And that model is now housing a few thousand people and going really well. Started to raise money from some pension funds, our more institutional investors, where the first investors were more us and foundations, that kind of stuff. And those funds are still maturing, but the earliest one, Real Lettings, has produced a pretty decent return. I think it will be in the high single digits return performance on that, which will be X as well as exhibition impact. So that'll be a good example. In the impact venture space, so there's a really interesting fund there called Fair by Design, which we developed sort of proactively with a partner and Joseph Roundtree Foundation, one of the biggest foundations in the UK, plus others, which aims at investing in startup businesses, mainly tech businesses, that tackle the fact that people in poverty pay more for crucial goods and services. So if you're poor, you pay more for your energy, you find it hard to get banking services, or you pay more for it, you find it hard to get insured, or if you can get insured, it's expensive. All these things have a sort of cost premium if you're poor. And that fund invests in businesses that try and tackle that and then measures how much money it saved people. It's, the savings are really quite impressive. And there's a particular company invested in which has driven the overall fund is returning very well. And I think a company they invested in there called Wage Stream, which basically tries to mean that people don't have to use high cost payday credit by partnering with big employers, enabling people to essentially borrow forward against salary by small amounts of money. Otherwise, you'd be going to predatory payday lenders, basically. And they work with big employers who have quite large numbers of people on fairly low incomes who need that service. And they've been extremely successful. They're now raising money from sort of commercial venture capital fund, but their sort of first key investor was this impact-driven fund that we'd endorsed, and that's both the commercial and impact success at a real scale, which is really interesting. On the debt side, I mean, so this covers a broad range of things, but to give an illustration of it, we're the largest shareholder in Charity Bank, which is that's what it says on the tin. It's a bank in the UK that banks specifically charities and charitable organizations who often struggle to get conventional banking services and loan finance from some of the mainstream banks. They have a sort of broad reach into all sorts of different charities and large to small right across the UK. And so we've sort of really been key in capitalizing them and helping them grow and develop. And they've been growing that loan book really impressively in the last few years. And we're an equity holder there, but in the long, again, the financial performance is now looking pretty good. And then on the social outcomes side, an example of a really interesting scheme there in Manchester, Greater Manchester Housing Partnerships, one of our funds is invested in, which essentially works with young people who are either were homeless or at high risk of becoming homeless, looks to house them, support them, gets paid by the Greater Manchester Authority if they stay in a sustained tenancy and make progress towards employment over a long period. And a vision that was going to help a few hundred people. That was so successful. The local government liked it so much. They scaled up to 1,500 people, hoping to maybe scale again in the future. And that's also returning money to investors as a decent, mid-single digit kind of return as well. So there's just a few of the kinds of things that we've going on.
What about Second Nature and Urban Jungle?
So Second Nature is a company that helps manage long-term health conditions, particularly diabetes. So it provides mainly online enabled support to people who have type 2 diabetes to manage their condition, to avoid them ending up in hospital, because it's very easy to have crisis diabetes, end up in hospital. Very bad outcomes, both for the health service and for the individual if that happens. And so they provide the support to people remotely delivered. Been very successful. I think last time I checked, it's been commissioned by, 50 or 60 NHS National Health Service trusts across the UK. So it started quite small. And as scaled up, it says it's one of these sort of tech driven. It came out of a Bethnal Green Ventures, which is a tech incubator accelerator type. The UK has been around for a long time, and we've backed for a while. That's one of their really successful kind of graduates. There's really having an impact on a big health issue. Urban Jungle is another example of this sort of inclusive financial services kind of model. I mentioned the Wage Stream one, where there's lots of people who find it really hard to get insurance for all sorts of reasons. And Urban Jungle will have, through a lot of very clever ways of cutting data, underwriting and using analysis differently, and just looking in places that mainstream insurers wouldn't look. They provide insurance services to people who really struggle to get them. So a big chunk of their clients are public housing, social housing tenants who often find getting insurance really difficult. That's being both impact success because not being able to get insurance is a real problem for people, or they have to get incredibly expensive insurance, but it's commercially successful as well as in providing that sort of support.
There's this persistent narrative that social investments can't deliver competitive financial returns. Based on your experience and the data you've seen, what's the truth here? How do you respond to that sort of criticism?
They definitely can do. They don't always. And some of the examples I've talked about there are really pretty financially, commercially successful as well as delivering great impact. Something like Waystream or Urban Jungle or many of those outcome contracts. I'd say not everywhere and not everything. And there are parts of the market that are not suitable for more fiduciary commercial time investment, but there are parts that are. And one thing we've done at BSC is we launched back in 2020 an investment trust. It's a partnership with Schroders, a fund manager, so the BSC Schroders Social Impact Trust, which is a listed investment trust available on the stock exchange for anyone to buy, where we package together a set of investments, which are some of the more tried and tested ones, if you like, in a vehicle that anyone can buy into. And that's credible. And that people have invested in that. And so it shows that you can create something that looks and feels a bit more mainstream, perhaps, and while also creating a clear, measurable social impact.
Which areas is this tension most acute?
The financial return impact sort of tension.
There's areas that are definitely commercial and there's areas that aren't. Which are the areas that you see are most difficult?
I think it's back to this point I had before about trying to do particularly lending to smaller organizations, and you need some sort of subsidy or guarantee cover. And well, you can get that to a point that's commercial. And recently, one of the large British banks has co-invested with us in that sort of space because there's a government guarantee that's big enough they can get comfortable. That's still quite tricky, and particularly if the fund managers involved are also relatively small and nascent. So that feels like there's a way to go there in terms of making some of that bit of the market genuinely investable for more fiduciary investors. That would be definitely an example of that, I think.
You are targeting a lower return overall at BSC in order to crowd in more private capital.
It's not just in order to crowd in private, it's also for a couple of other things, so that we can do experimental things, which we're not expecting loads of private capital to come into now, but might pave the way for private capital in the future. So we can do some of that. And it's because also we carry a sort of market building remit, which has a cost to it. So we're paying for that. So our BSC return is going to be less, partly because we're paying for a lot of that activities we do for the benefit of the market, if you like, that a commercial actor wouldn't do.
What would you say to people who argue that very model proves that social investments can't produce a true market rate competitive return?
No commercial investor would invest in the whole BSC portfolio because it contains all these mixture of different things, including historic experimental stuff and so on. But at an individual fund level, you can see individual funds that are producing returns that are suitable for something where there is of commercial target. And indeed, our biggest single type of co-investor now are local government pension schemes. They're fiduciary pension funds that have responsibilities to pay money to pensioners, and they're the single biggest source of people investing in the same funds as us. So that sort of demonstrates that at least parts of the market are absolutely breaking through at that point. Others, there's probably more work to do.
But we as a society need to cover the whole spectrum. And so I guess your argument is getting a concessionary rate of return, and maybe where some of these pensions are invested, is necessary in order to cover the whole market and allocates capital more efficiently than, let's say, grants or philanthropy, so to speak.
Well, I mean, grants are a massive part of the story, and you need grants to do lots of things that social investment can't do. And you need grants, and wearing another hat like chair, a grant maker who also does social investment, but we're very clear the stuff we need to do because it's got to be a grant because you can't possibly invest in it. So you need a range of options and a range of tools. Either you can use grants smarter if you think about it as part of a spectrum of capital. And also there's a thing about this of being dynamic. If something doesn't stay in the same box, you can try something, and when you do it a second time bigger or having learned the lessons of the first time, then you can generate a different return or take a different kind of risk or whatever. So things kind of move along the journey. And part of BSC's job is to catalyze stuff at an earlier stage sometimes.
But BSC is absolutely independent, and it's not technically a government organization, and you are self-sustaining. Is that correct?
Yes. There's no one from government on our board, not on the public balance sheet on money. We're not accountable that way. Our aim is to be sustainable. Now, clearly, 1% return when inflation is 3% is not quite self-sustaining, because in real terms, the value of our capital has decreased in real terms, even if not in cash terms. And we have had some extra dormant bank accounts over time. Occasionally, if we were given, for example, an extra chunk of dormant bank accounts when the sort of energy price spike happened in order to launch a new fund, which was around supporting particularly community-based charities to improve their energy efficiency. So lending money to solar panels or installation and that kind of thing. We had a grant pot from a foundation alongside it. So given some additional dormant account money sometimes, but we sort of plan our activities on the basis that we won't get any more money. If we do get any more, that's a bonus, but we operate in a way that we're sustainable for a sustained period without new infusions of capital.
And you've never been recapitalized since the original founding. You've always grown your capital, correct?
So we've had some small additional amounts of capital along the way, but not very large chunks. So currently, actually, our total value of our balance sheet is fairly similar to where we started, in fact.
Let's talk about catalytic capital, which fascinates me as a concept. How do you define it?
Catalyze is the word, isn't it? That starts something that has potential to grow and become bigger. So I think this is, and so it's different. It's not necessarily concessionary capital, which is a different thing. That's more sort of, I see it sort of permanently taking a different position. But a great example of where we, I think, do things which are catalytic is by being a significant cornerstone in the first fund. A fund manager that wants to do an impact fund for the first time is trying something different. And if we buy into it and we think it's good enough, we're prepared to come in the first close with a significant ticket sometimes and make something happen. That's catalytic. You're taking sort of first mover risk almost. That's a great example of the kind of thing we do that I would say is catalytic.
Do you have specific tools that BSC employs to attract private finance and multiply your impact beyond your direct capital deployment?
That sort of first mover piece is definitely one piece. We've often gone out and designed funds. So we don't just sort of wait for fund managers to come to us with ideas. We've sometimes seen gaps in the market or seen where there's potential, actually gone out and found someone to work with us to build that, because we see that's where, the potential to attract money. And that's again linked to our sort of, that's a sort of a cost that we carry that a lot of investors wouldn't, but we see that as our role. So quite recently, for example, we saw an opportunity to sort of recapitalize it. Gone to see for a bit. There's a market for community-owned renewables in England. So we went out and sort of found the fund manager who had capacity in that space. And we've been the sort of first cornerstone with them as a partner, and the money they can raise in private finance to set up a new fund to help capitalize community ownership of renewable energies. That's another where we sort of went out and made something happen, because we saw there was an opportunity here. The new government is keen on doing stuff in that space. That's going to take a bit of time. Well, let's get something moving, get some pipeline built, get some momentum going here.
What about risk mitigation strategies? Can you give me some examples of some of the tools that BSC uses to catalyze further private investment?
I've mentioned one or two of these already. So government guarantees are a really key one. So the British Business Bank, which is sort of the government development bank in the UK, in certain circumstances will provide aspects of a loss guarantee, which then can make particularly some of the social lending products more viable. And we've used that in actually several structures. For example, one we did during COVID, a kind of COVID response fund. Another one we've done recently about supporting lending to micro businesses in particularly sort of disadvantaged communities. That government guarantee piece has been really key. And the other bit is sort of blending grant and alongside loans. And that might be grant for capacity building for organizations so they're able to take investment, or indeed grant to cover transaction costs of administering very small loans in specialized areas and that kind of thing. So just some of the sort of tactics that we've drawn on over the years.
Was there a specific example of where one of these tools unlocked a significant additional investment that wouldn't have occurred?
Yeah, so I think the one I just alluded to, so the Community Enterprise Investment Fund we've just done, which capitalizes CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, which do micro lending to businesses, particularly in communities where the mainstream banks tend not to operate for various historic reasons, or people with slightly worse credit histories. By bringing in the British Business Bank guarantee there, and then BSC as a junior debt layer, we've catalyzed senior at a pretty large volume from one of the large UK banks, who definitely would not be able to do that without creating that structure of government guarantee, first loss, BSC, piece of junior debt, and then you can get a much larger piece of senior debt from a bank. Let's say that market has a big capital need. I mean, even with that, we're not meeting the whole capital need that sector has, but it's a big step change from what was there before.
One thing that caught my attention is your philosophy on impact. Your website indicates that the funds you invest in create the direct impact. So what is BSC's role? How exactly do you think about your impact responsibility, and what's the distinctive value you add to the equation?
We do often think about investor contribution, which is often part of the sort of the impact investing lexicon, but we think quite hard about that when we make an investment. So what is our contribution here? Would this happen anyway? what does BSC bring to this? So is it our capital we're bringing? Is it some advocacy or tool we're bringing? Are we bringing an impact framework that makes the fund more impactful? So yeah, that kind of investor contribution piece is quite important to how we think about an investment. And it's very active part of our investment committee decision making. Sort of, is BSC, what are we doing here that is making something happen that is additional or wouldn't have happened? Gives something a better prospect for success than otherwise it would have had.
You described bringing the most relevant experts from your network to the table, generating ideas, connecting capital to where it's most needed. What does this look like in practice, this approach?
We do a lot of partnerships with kind of expert organizations in different fields. And I mentioned earlier the partnership with the Church Roundtree Foundation about the Fair by Design Fund, because they're experts in poverty and that sort of work. And when we built the Women Safe Homes Fund, the one that particularly focuses on housing for women fleeing domestic abuse, we worked with Women's Aid and a whole group of the sort of women's sector charities who had the expertise in that field. We're currently working on social outcomes contracts, trying to persuade government to do more on that. We're working with organizations that delivered those contracts and a group of local authority commissioners. So people who are actually, running these services in local government. So we like sort of pulling together these sort of groups of people who have expertise, because we know we don't have expertise in particular policy areas, and we're not the experts on child poverty or healthcare or homelessness, but we're experts on building investment vehicles that work in those contexts and help deliver impact. But we need people who are subject matter experts that we know we're not.
Impact measurement is notoriously difficult to quantify. How do you help your portfolio funds with this challenge? And have there been any KPIs that have proven the most meaningful in this regard?
I wouldn't pick a single KPI. Exactly. One of the things that we are very conscious of is that we invest in such a broad range of things, and that trying to impose any sort of standardized KPIs across our whole portfolio is almost certainly impossible and doesn't really work. What we have done is, in particular areas, built certain measures. So most developed in the housing area, because we have quite a lot of funds that do things that are similar enough that you can ask them to measure some of the same things. Like, for example, we've looked at across all our funds, are we building or buying homes in the areas of greatest housing need, as measured by certain sort of fairly standard economic indicators, or are we in the areas where there's the greatest gap between rents and house prices and average wages? So, where the affordability challenge is the biggest. Are we concentrating in those? So we can measure those across all our funds. So for sectors that only applies, so it doesn't apply for the whole portfolio. What we do with every fund is we have something called an impact canvas, which is we agree as part of the process of signing up to a fund, we agree with the fund manager, what does impact measurement and practice look like in this fund? And we agree that up front and then review it annually. We have an impact sort of conversation with the fund annually. We agreed up front, this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at these KPIs. You're going to improve your processes in this way. Where are we up to on that? How's it going?
The policy environment obviously plays a huge role in what's possible in social impact investment. What policy elements are the most important for growing this market, and what barriers still need to be addressed? And given your extensive government background, how does BSC engage with policymakers to create a more favorable condition?
A week ago, published a paper basically on this topic through the Institute for Policy Research at University of Bath, where I'm a visiting fellow. So I'll try and summarize some of it. So we've become increasingly convinced of the importance of this, actually. I think there was a phase, actually quite a lot of my early time in BSC, where partly because government wasn't that interested in engaging with this question, I think we thought we could get a lot done anyway. We got quite a lot done anyway, but in the last few years, we've sort of lent more back into this because we realized quite how important it is to unblocking stuff for us. So I think there's a few things that government can do. These are not mutually exclusive. You can do all of them. So there's government can be directly an impact investor itself and invest in funds and make them happen. And we've actually made some investments on behalf of government a couple of times, particularly in the homelessness space. Government can commission services in a way that facilitates impact investment contributing to those outcomes. This is my point about the outcomes-based contracting and so on. Government can create incentives like tax breaks or other things that, so there's, for example, in the UK, we have community investment tax relief, which actually enables people to receive tax relief for investing in certain things which have a social impact. That could be expanded. You could do much more with those kinds of things. And then there's a kind of regulatory environment, often in particular sectors, where government's policies can be decisive on whether or not impact investment can work. So again, an example I've alluded to earlier around community ownership of renewable energy assets, which can be really beneficial and drive real both financial value for community as well as increased take-up of renewables. At one point, that was a big market because government has some sort of subsidy and regulatory regime that really supported that. The regulatory regime shifted away, it's made it much harder. That's now possibly being unlocked again. Those regulations are pretty key. So PSE is increasingly lent into this. We've come to the conclusion it's more and more important for us, actually.
As I was preparing for our talk, I kept thinking, if only someone would write a book that could make the case for understanding cultural factors when creating public policy and explain this in plain and simple, easy to understand English. If only there was a book we could all read. Do you know any book like this?
My Culture and Values at the Heart of Policymaking, published in the middle of 2020, came out of a lot of my reflections, some of the stuff we've talked about already, really, about just how, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You need to think about how people really engage with government, policy, environments, and other factors.
You slept over that, right? You published this book in 2020. It's called Culture and Values at the Heart of Policymaking. Tell me what motivated you to write this book and what is it about?
It came out of a lot of reflecting on the years, mainly I'd spent in government, particularly, and about this question of what works, what doesn't work, why do things not play out the way you think they are, why do different policies deliver different things, what experiences I'd had and learnings. A lot of it is about how what actually plays out in both politics and policy is less driven by economics, less driven by financial incentives, less driven by a lot of our rational models of how things work, and is much more tied into unspoken norms of behavior, symbols and stories and myths that are tied up in culture, and then sort of underlying ethical values and beliefs that people have. And those things drive both political behavior and there's some voting and how accountability for politicians work. That's a whole sort of political science piece in the book. And also drive how policy making interacts with the gritty reality of humanity in the real world. And you have to think about the culture that policy is working in, the languages people are speaking, the stories they're telling each other. That's how the real impacts sort of play out. And if you put that framework into how you think about policy, it needs you to change the emphasis of different policy tools compared to a classic way of doing it. So I think you then slightly play down some of the rationalist approaches of evidence building, financial incentives, resting on legal structures, and you need to be more anthropological, more understand symbols, narratives, stories. It's a case of localizing things more, but a lot of the reasons why you do think centrally sort of break down when you think about it through that lens. Culture in institutions becomes incredibly important when you think about building institutions as carriers of culture rather than just execution machines. Some of those sort of facets are important. That's a very short summary of a lot of thinking.
Can you give an example of an instance where you witnessed the policy's unintended cultural impact and how it eventually should have been addressed or was addressed?
In my time in the Ministry of Justice, one of the things I worked on, I said, was sentencing policy. So you're saying, what's the legal framework about what sentence you get for committing certain crimes? And we have all these sort of bizarre discussions mainly with politicians, often as senior judges, about we should increase the sentence for doing X or Y because that will send a message that we take it seriously, it'll act as a deterrent and this sort of thing. And we had no evidence or understanding of how the people who may potentially commit those crimes, or indeed had committed in the past, would actually react to that. Would they know that you changed the rules? Would they care? Would that even sort of speak to why they did it in the first place? Would it affect their behavior in any way? What was their understanding of those sort of narratives and stories around sentencing? Would they, in the groups where particularly perpetrators of that crime came from, how do they talk about criminal justice system sentencing? What do they tell themselves? We just have no idea. It was a classic example of this sort of, and it's sort of, you could feel this at the time. I think it's making these sort of bizarre decisions that are entirely divorced from almost in a sort of anthropological sense. So like the actual living experience, the people who you're trying to focus this thing on. All very, very bizarre.
Looking forward, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for social impact investment in the UK? And are there particular social issues that you are passionate about addressing, but haven't yet found a way to make them investable?
The biggest challenge is the scale one. I said, hey, we've grown this market, we've got lots of things that work, but the scale of the challenges we're trying to deal with is just another level of size. And people with ill health conditions are not able to get treated because of capacity in health service, people who got poor housing, educational underattainment, particularly among certain communities and groups. I mean, these problems are big and they need a lot of money. And while there are increasingly proven models of how impact investment can help, it's never the only tool, but it can help solve some of these problems. We're just not at the scale yet. So that's the scale, but also the opportunity. I mean, that's the challenge, but also the opportunity. The challenge is we're not at the level we need to be to make a real difference. The opportunity is we have in many areas increasing evidence that there is the potential to have that impact on the big prize of making a real difference. And then on the social challenges where I'd love to address them, but it's really hard from an investment perspective. I'm going to come back to one I've talked about a bit in this call, which is criminal justice area. I'm fascinated by. I think it's incredibly important. I think we do pretty badly in the UK on a lot of measures. We have a court system with massive backlogs. We lock up a large percentage of population of people who mainly then reoffend because they're treated with, prison system doesn't help. We very bad at housing people when they come out of prison, which causes them to reoffend again. Public have very low faith in the system, low trust in policing out the whole. But most indicators, it's pretty bad experience for like everyone involved, victims of crime, criminals, people who work in it. It's generally pretty poor. And there's a kind of fundamental bedrock for civilized society where you get that right. But it's actually, investment as a tool I haven't found a way we can get there yet. There's also other problems we can tackle more effectively, but from a purely personal perspective, that's an issue I am really incredibly interested in and passionate about. And actually, the impact investment tool is not well suited, at least not at the moment, at least not in the UK context.
Circling back to your comment about the need for more scale, what needs to change to make that possible?
Part of it is time, and it does take time to build these things and to see investment through their life cycle and out the other side with returns, with evidence that then means people can come in. So we just got to get there. We talked right at the beginning about the misconception. I think this sort of simplistic views of trade-off. People say, oh, well, this is because this is seeking social impact. It must be concessionary or must be riskier. Well, in some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. Then there's some perception problems there. I think there's also a bit of a institutional sort of built-in bias in, like in any big organization, particularly in big fund managers, to doing the same thing again. And also there's a chicken and egg problem that the financial service industry likes doing very big things because its transaction costs are lower. And if you can get something to a big scale, then lots of people invest in it. But to get it to the big scale, people have got to invest in it first. So there's this chicken and egg problem about you can only get big when you've got big already.
Theoretically, if we're getting market returns, the money should be there.
And in some areas it's starting to happen, but other market return, people still have to be convinced that those are sustainable, that they aren't, concealing something high risk, some things they don't understand. So yeah, I think we will get there in some areas and you can see some traction in some areas, but not everywhere yet.
Stephen, I got a few rapid fire questions for you before we wrap up. Don't overthink these. Give me whatever comes off your mind. Or if nothing does, feel free to take a pass because that's okay too. If you had to name the single most important challenge in the social impact investing space at this time, what would it be?
Reaching the scale of the challenge.
What do you know now about social impact investing that you wish you knew in 2016 when you joined BSC?
I didn't appreciate how the sort of time arc of doing this kind of investing and that actually meaningful things happen takes quite a long time in this space because investments take a long time and the sort of learning cycle is longer and the redevelopment cycle is longer. And I don't think I understood that coming from a government background.
We always love to talk about winners, but this time I'm going to ask the opposite. You don't have to name names, but can you describe an investment that you made and that you were convinced of at the time you invested that it ticked all your social impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out, went pear-shaped. And what did you learn from that experience?
I actually pick a whole sort of class of investments almost rather than a single, which is the area that I'd be really I was sort of been surprised we've constantly done quite badly in is actually education. And you think, okay, I'm sure there's a lot, obviously we can invest in lots of organizations that'll boost education. It's obvious case for impact investing. And we have invested quite a lot through various funds and things, and the record has not been very good. And I think what I've learned from that, or we learned from that, is, and maybe this is a UK specific thing, the sort of route to market and distribution and scale for those is a nightmare because the school system is incredibly fragmented. You usually have a great high impact thing. You need to convince like individual school, or even the academy chains only have a few schools to take this thing up. And it's just, you just can't get there. And quite a lot of things that look pretty plausible have failed because then I think I certainly didn't really understand that. Yeah, you say, higher education, sure. That obviously there's loads of important investments that must work.
No brainer.
Our record is not great on some of that, I think.
The converse of that, can you describe an investment that you had some level of skepticism either at the time you invested or maybe you ultimately passed on it and in the end it turned out way better than you thought and you were pleased you had invested, or if you had passed on it, you wish you hadn't, and what was the lesson you learned from that experience?
Specific example, actually. So I think I mentioned we're shareholders in a bank, social bank called Unity Trust Bank, which has origins in the trade union movement. It banks lots of social purpose, faith, other sort of organizations. And we made an investment a long time ago, just when I first started. And there was a point when we could have increased our investment. And they were looking to raise some more capital and came to us and said, oh, could you be part of this? Well, we've already got an investment in this bank. We're not quite sure their impact practice is quite as good as we'd like. Why do we do more of this? I mean, that is our best returning investment in our portfolio at the moment. With the original use trust evidence from a financial point of view, had we invested that additional capital at that point, the return on it would have been very good financially, and their impact practice has got absolutely loads better because they got some new people in, we focused on it, put some effort into it. So had we committed that additional capital at that point, we would have made a great financial return, and we would have been part of helping them do even more on the impact side, which is now really pretty good. The lesson now, I think, is possibly being stuck in a slightly static view of an organization rather than thinking about where it was going. We invest in a point in time without thinking about what's the trajectory here and what's the potential upside and potential downside, and thinking more dynamically about that possibly.
If someone wants to get into the social impact investing space, where would you advise them to start?
We have people from really different backgrounds here at BSC, like an ex-government person, we've got ex-financiers, we've got ex-consultants, we've got ex-charity people, we've got a whole range. So I think what I'd say is there isn't one route and there isn't a kind of clear path to do this and this. I think having some different experiences is a good idea. So if you can have some connection to charities plus some financial connection to the finance world and also connection to the government world, trying to have some intersection in your career, and whether that's through employment or indeed volunteering or non-executive things or other roles, having a blend, I think, is good. And I think the people who thrive are ones who have got bring some slightly different perspectives together. But I don't see a kind of a path that I would recommend everyone to do.
Stephen, I really enjoyed this. We've covered a lot of ground here today. Amazing stories. Great example. I know you're a UK organization, but Better Society Capital it's a good model for other countries.
Others are creating sort of similar organizations or related organizations around the world. We talked a lot of them, and it's great to see it growing. But yeah, it's been a great conversation. Thank you very much, Scott. Really enjoyed it.
I appreciate you taking me through all this and behind the scenes, what happens behind the curtain, so to speak, because I've learned a lot from it. Now tell everyone what's the best way they can find out about all the great things you're doing at Better Society Capital, your websites and social media and stuff.
Yeah, look at our website, and we recently published our impact report for 2024, so which you can get on the front page of our website. Click on Impact Report 2024. That will give a really great summary of what we've been doing recently, some of the key facts and figures, theory of change, what we're here for. That'd be a good place to start.
And your website's bettersocietycapital.com, all one word. Spell it out like it sounds, nothing cutesy there. Yeah. And what's the best way for people to contact you?
Via LinkedIn is a good way of getting me. Yeah, probably works.
All right, everybody, go to bettersocietycapital.com. Lots of good information there. And Stephen, thanks again.
That's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Scott.
All right, goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.